Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Natural Areas Association's virtual symposium, Shared Stewardship, Collaborating to Effectively Co-Manage the Chippewa National Forest. I'm Lisa Smith, Executive Director of the Natural Areas Association, and I'm being joined today by my colleagues, Maura McGinty-Kloss, Programs and Communications Manager, and Amy Wills, Operations and Membership Manager. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program. And while NAA is once again convening in-person events, which is very exciting, we're pleased to continue offering virtual programming because we strongly believe that good science and collaboration must be available to everyone, and not just those who have the time, ability, and means to travel to an in-person event. I'd like to thank our sponsors of this program today, the USDA Forest Service. We've been longtime partners, our organization and the agency. Together, we've produced a lot of wonderful programming and have worked together to convey good science to those who are boots on the ground working to manage nature. And I'd like to thank them especially for this program, which is a very special one today, being brought to you by the both of us. So, the Natural Areas Association, for those of you who are new to us, is a national nonprofit organization that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes to protect biodiversity. We contend that protecting natural areas in perpetuity requires quality science to inform practices and access to reliable resources. Given this, NAA provides science-based content for practitioners and researchers, those seeking applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge related to the management of biodiversity and ecologically significant lands and waters. NAA shares a suite of programs, products, and services that allow us to address a broad spectrum of current and emerging issues, methodologies, and best practices in a manner that is useful and convenient for busy practitioners. And our programs are designed to achieve on-the-ground outcomes and to encourage practitioner participation, especially with one another. I'd like to share just a few examples of these programs with you. We won't get into too much of our work today as we've got a big program for you. But our 49th Natural Areas Conference is coming up, and it will be held in Duluth, Minnesota, the first full week of September this year. The title of the conference is Superior Visions, Navigating Complexity Amid Constant Change. And the conference will feature more than 100 presentations developed by and for natural areas practitioners, including keynotes and plenary sessions, concurrent breakout sessions, half-day hands-on workshops, posters, and field workshops. We are so excited to be in person for this event because we know how much it means for we know how much it means for you to be together, learning and sharing with one another, and we hope that many of you will join us. For many of you, Duluth is pretty close, so we hope you'll give it some consideration. One of the exciting offerings this year that we're thrilled has come to fruition is a job hiring event. Once again, we are working with our Forest Service partners and the agency's human resources staff to bring attendees and others this important opportunity. Forest Service staff will be on hand to talk to prospective employees about job openings within the agency on Wednesday, September 7th and Thursday, September 8th. They are especially eager to talk to students and recent graduates, but not limited to these folks. For those who can't attend the conference, the event will be virtual as well. Or if you do live close to Duluth, or it's not too far of a drive for you, Thursday, September 8th, will be an open house where non-attendees are welcome to visit in person. Registration for the conference is open, and early bird rates are available until the end of July. All of the information is on our website, so spend a little bit of time there and learn more. And we hope to see many of you in Duluth this September. Another program element that NAA offers is its Stewardship in Action field workshops. We're working with our partners at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Scientific and Natural Areas program to showcase a very successful model in private-public conservation that has resulted in significant prairie protection in Minnesota. Fragmented Prairies and Grasslands, Reconnecting Habitats Through Collaborative Partnerships is an in-person workshop and will be held July 19th through the 21st of this year. So just in a few weeks, and that will be held in southwestern Minnesota. During the workshop, we will visit 7 prairies and explore various grassland conservation and management strategies, along with partnerships required to make them successful. We have practitioners registered from many of the tallgrass prairie states for this field tour. It's a fantastic example of partners coming together to offer a small, intimate workshop where learning and sharing results results in great outcomes for land managers. There are a few spaces left, so check out our website at naturalareas.org for more information. And if you don't get in, know that we will be filming this workshop in the hopes of exposing more than the in-person attendees to great natural areas conservation work. On that note, I want to emphasize that the purpose of today's symposium is for land management practitioners to understand how to effectively partner with one another while considering co-management of tribal lands. The focus will be on collaboration strategies and opportunities, highlighting new learning and exploring challenges. While we understand that there are multiple perspectives surrounding these topics, we will not be addressing issues and questions outside of the purpose of this program. But if you do have questions beyond today's focus, we encourage you to email Keith Karnes or Jenn Youngblood directly, and you'll be hearing from both of those folks in a moment. Maura will provide you their email addresses, and we thank you in advance for honoring this request. So it's time to start the program. However, before we do get into the presentations and introductions, and even though we are not convening this workshop in person, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have actively conserved and protected the natural resources of the Chippewa National Forest for centuries, including all Minnesota Chippewa tribes and currently the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, who recognize this area as their homeland. The idea for this program began almost 2 years ago, but as with many things, COVID-19 delayed making it a reality. Originally, this was supposed to be an in-person workshop. However, the fluidity of the pandemic and the desire to share this information with a wide audience led to a decision to rethink the program as a virtual symposium. Today, we're shining a light on co-management between the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the USDA Forest Service. This relationship is unique due to the overlap of the homelands of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the USDA Forest Service, honoring treaty rights and sovereignty. A memorandum of understanding was established to create a shared decision-making model between the band and the Forest Service to advance shared priorities and projects on a landscape scale across shared boundaries. Signed in October of 2019, the MOU is still fairly new, and I'm sure that our presenters today will share many insights as to the understanding and framework from the MOU as it was put into practice. We as an organization are proud to support programming that can potentially help others to build relationships and embrace the traditional practices of the original land stewards. As part of today's program, we will not only hear from individuals who represent the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the USDA Forest Service, but we will also learn about the ongoing projects within this shared landscape. We hope that this symposium will not only offer new learning and knowledge sharing, but will inspire you to find ways to collaborate with tribal nations and agency partners in your area. I'd also like to take a moment to thank two people who were instrumental in developing this program and agenda and working very closely with the NAA. A big shout out to Todd Tisler. Todd is the Fish and Wildlife Program Manager for the USDA Forest Service on the Chippewa National Forest. And Micah Raber, who is the Renewable and Resources Staff Officer for the Forest Service on the Chippewa National Forest. Without their assistance and support, this program would not have been possible. So thanks to you both very much. It's my pleasure to introduce our two opening speakers at this point, Jenn Youngblood and Keith Karnes. Jenn Youngblood is currently the first Deputy Forest Supervisor on the Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota. She is a native of what is now known as the state of California and has lived in both Alaska and Wisconsin. Prior to the Forest Service, Jenn had a diverse background serving as a registered nurse in forensic investigations, law enforcement, and as an adjunct professor of environmental science at Carroll University. Previously, Jenn owned a consulting firm and until 2013 conducted work in many Arctic nations prior to her federal career. Jenn holds multiple degrees, including 2 undergraduate degrees, registered nursing and environmental science and chemistry with a physical geography minor. She holds a master's degree in adult education and a doctor of jurisprudence with an emphasis on natural resource law and federal Indian law, which was conferred on her in 2012 before realizing her Forest Service career. She also believes in paying it for, oh, I'm sorry, forgive me, I just skipped an important note. Jenn believes in honoring the federal commitment to tribes and herself as an interesting path, owing her experiences to honoring the wisdom and words of her great-grandmother and grandmother. She also believes in paying it forward by collaborating, mentoring, and sharing ideas with others to forge strong relationships and to facilitate achievement of land management goals to sustain the nation's forests and grasslands for future generations. Keith Karnes is forest director for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and earned his bachelor's degree in forestry from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point in 2003. Since 2006, when he began working for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, Keith has been blending the best available science with traditional ecological knowledge to make things work in today's world. In 2017, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council appointed Keith to the Minnesota Forest Resources Council as the tribal affairs representative. And as forestry director, Keith is deeply committed to the Leech Lake Band's tribal ideology, which holds resiliency, adaptability, and biodiversity and balance as key tenets. As Keith explains, tribes as a whole, they look at the forest much more holistically. Traditional indigenous homelands are still homelands today and should be managed accordingly. Band members look at super canopy trees as elders that they are related to. Stories have come down through the generations about tribal members. They don't live in the forest, they are the forest. They are the wildlife. These are all one family and they're all together. Everything has its part. And I think that says it all. Jenn and Keith, please take it from here.
A little bit before we really get going, I want to talk about the historical background of the Chippewa National Forest and the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and how the lands interact. This area, this national forest it was the only one that was ever created for the benefit of the Indian people. And I know that it says that it was created from Indian lands, but any national forest really, if you think back to it, all of it has been created from Indian lands. But this one was set aside. It was brought up by the League of Women Voters, who brought it up that they saw that there were too many trees that were being harvested and too many of the big ones are being harvested, and they wanted to preserve some of these for the indigenous people that lived up here. So that's the history of how it started way back then, 1908, and then moving forward. Next slide, please. Over the years, we have had concerns. You know, I mean, what is the Forest Service's trust responsibility here, where we have more shared boundary lines than anywhere else in the state with the national forest. Timber harvest has always been an issue. We're going to get into that a little bit later, and I'm going to show you why it's been an issue to the tribe. And we would have these discussions. They're meant to be meaningful discussions, but they've been more of just discussions early on, where consultation would be the Forest Service coming over, we're going to do this project, and now we've talked to you, like it was a checkbox. And so now we're realizing that some of the issues we were having is a lot of the people here, they weren't speaking the U.S. Forest Service jargon. They weren't speaking in boards and chords, talking about basal area, A lines, B lines, and this, that, and the other thing. And the focus was on timber extraction, and what is the overall vision, that they're bringing to this as part of their trust responsibility. So we wanted to get into that, and then we wanted to get into start creating a decision-making model. And that's something Jenn is going to get more into that as we go forward here. But getting ownership of decisions from both governments, true ownership of decisions, not a decision from one side and some words from the other. I mean, it has to be an even playing field. So a lot of this culminated in 2016 when Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, they sent a letter to DC to the Forest Service chief. And once he got that, and we were talking about how we didn't feel like the Chippewa National Forest was truly holding up their trust responsibilities. They weren't paying attention to how we felt about the timber extraction. And the Forest Service chief sent a response letter. And I think, Jen, you're going to take it now.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So let me begin by providing a bit of history as to why and what of this commitment, as it was directed by the chief to the region and the Forest Service to create this MOU. So as Keith mentioned, after the Forest Service Washington office received a letter from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, the Chief Tidwell, who was our previous chief in September of 2016, sent a letter back to the band, to the chairman of the Leech Lake Band. And really what this letter did is it included a commitment to develop this shared decision-making model for commercial timber harvesting and other natural resource considerations. And the chief agreed to work with the band using traditional ecological knowledge offered by the band and to expand the use of Tribal Forest Protection Act work to give voice to the band's land management objectives. And so you understand that really this is not anything new in the Forest Service. This MOU was not the first Forest Service tribal MOU in the agency. In the Eastern region, there's probably at least a minimum of 50 to 75 MOUs that we work with. And what these MOUs, and this one in particular, was it's a commitment that the Forest Service has made demonstrating that we intend to honor our federal trust responsibility. And so, like Keith said, the history of the Chippewa National Forest, it was initially designated between 1902 and 1908 from the Morris Act of 1902 as the Minnesota Forest Reserve. And there's specific language in that act that does talk about the creation for the benefit of Indian people. Then we moved to 1908, the Minnesota Forest Act of 1908, and that also was to create jobs, economic prosperity, and to also create the forest that was managed by the USDA Forest Service. And so this is really the only national forest in the agency that was created by statute. And when the forest was created, this meant that approximately 90% of the reservation is now found within the proclamation boundaries of the forest, and about 45% of the forest lies within the reservation boundaries. And this continues today. So it creates this very unique land-based situation. And so this unique overlap of boundaries has provided a really unique opportunity to implement a shared stewardship strategy, as well as enhance the federal responsibility to Indian nations, which require the federal government and its representatives to support tribal self-governance and economic prosperity. So these legal responsibilities stem from the US government's treaty guarantees to protect Indian tribes and respect their sovereignty. So as we started having discussions in 2016 on this MOU, it was November of 2016, it took 3 years with the Forest Service, working with the band, the regional office, the Washington office, and really incorporating the voice of our Office of General Counsel to look at our guiding laws, our rules and authorities to create this MOU, which was signed by the regional forester and the chairman of Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in October of 2019. So again, it wasn't an overnight process, it was a very quick process. And so again, to get this MOU signed and to begin, long-term implementation, there were many, many steps in the process which were taken into consideration, including correlation to the forest plan. We have looked at DVCs, our desired vegetative conditions 1 through 5, and bringing them in. The creation of a shared decision-making model at the behest of the chief, which outlined a joint planning process incorporating NEPA, cooperating agency status, really intensive tribal consultation and collaboration, and really the practice of legal dispute resolution and how we would move forward if we weren't falling into some kind of place where we could agree or agree to disagree. And so as I talked about this shared decision-making model in the MOU, one thing I want you all to know is this language does not mean that the Forest Service can ignore the band, or the Leech Lake band can override Forest Service decisions for the Chippewa National Forest. But what it does mean is that the forest and the band are going to work collaboratively to develop objectives that aim to protect treaty resources and to meet the Chippewa Forest Plan objectives. And so again, implementation of this MOU has been an ongoing process for the past 3 years and has incorporated tribal and forest needs to manage and or protect tribal resources as needed. And we've been working together towards implementation of the MOU. And in this process, the forest has found that much of what is in the MOU was already being utilized on our forest projects. We were doing things, it's just kind of codifying them now. So one example of how this implementation has moved forward is that Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe has become much more active in the NEPA process, hence creating collaborative discussions between the forest and the band as we talk about and as we work with desired vegetative conditions, the forest plan, and all the other structures identified in the MOU. Next slide, please. So in the 2016 Chiefs letter, there were really 4 key points that I want to focus on, 2 of these points for this conversation today. These areas are the desired vegetative conditions correlated to the forest plan and the agency's desire for a shared decision-making model with the band. And so together, the forest and the band have worked to develop objectives that aim to protect treaty resources, as well as, again, as I said earlier, assisting the Chippewa National Forest to meet forest plan goals, standards, and objectives. And in this shared decision-making model, it outlines a joint planning process, incorporating several of our guiding laws and practices. And these are similar to what I mentioned earlier: the NEPA process, or the National Environmental Protection Act, cooperating agency status, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit more in depth shortly, along with extensive tribal consultation, collaboration, and our legal dispute resolution process. And so one thing I want to share about this is I was not on the forest, but I was in the regional office. So I've been able to see this process as it started and see how it's evolved and been part of these conversations. And what I want to share is the MOU was designed with several things in mind. One, really meeting our legal responsibility to the band. That was kind of the foundational piece, but also improving agency and forest efficiencies to meet the requirements of NEPA, and then really to better address overall the tribal concerns on the reservation through formal consultation and collaboration on forest management projects where we have that overlap, as well as those treaty ceded territories to have those conversations. And so one thing in this process I want people to know as well is when we engage other groups such as industry and other forest users, the Forest Service continues to be committed to this engagement with all of our other users. And this MOU has not diminished or should not have affected those opportunities for engagement with any other users. It's just a difference in the legal responsibilities we have to the government to government or nation to nation relationship codified in law and treaty, as well as being a multi-use agency serving all of our users and making sure that we are meeting the Forest Service mission to serve the public. And so one thing we've done is the Forest Service is committed to continue. We've started holding quarterly calls with industry. We're committed to continue holding those and keeping the lines of communication open with other user groups. So, and there remain those opportunities which have always been provided for full engagement on projects as requested and needed in alignment with what we're doing to honor our federal fiduciary responsibility to the band and honor the MOU. Next slide, please. So this might get a little boring and I don't want to dive too deep because that's the law in me, but I want to explain just a little bit of the legal context of what drives the MOU. First, we need to think about the original treaties made by and between the United States and Indian tribes. And the treaty period in this country spanned almost 100 years of the colonial period of US history lasting from 1789 to 1871. And during this time, over 500 treaties were signed. And so this is kind of the foundational piece that we need to think about of what is driving this MOU and the relationship, this unique relationship between the Forest Service and the band. It's these treaties that, and ensuing federal Indian law that has been created, that really creates and sets forth this legal relationship that's unique between the federal government and Indian tribes. And like I said, treaties form that foundation of this relationship. And the treaties have helped define all of these federal tribal relationships since the Supreme Court's earliest decisions. And it's codified through the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. It's found in 30 U.S. 116 and 1831 in the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. Chief Justice Marshall basically acknowledged that treaties were what set forth the definition of tribes as domestic dependent nations, and creating that relationship and that responsibility from the federal government to recognize tribes as a people and as nations and having unique legal status in this country. Next slide, please. So this is, Keith and I wanted to provide you with just kind of a quick visual of what some of the areas considered in this shared decision-making model language of the MOU was. And you can see it's very, it's very specific. We have natural resource management, economic development and employment, training and education, maintaining the Ojibwe cultural lifeways, and then regulatory jurisdiction. Much of these things in the shared decision-making model MOU also are the work we do as the Forest Service. We serve all the public. So everything that we do is dovetailed together to make sure that we're honoring this unique legal responsibility to the band, but we're also providing resources for everyone else of the American public that uses our resources. Next slide, please. And again, this is another visual of the shared decision-making model. And what I want to do is, I talked a little bit about trying to make sure we're having regular meetings, regular communication, but this is another visual of the shared decision-making model. And I want to bring your attention to the quarterly updates. We do these, this is part of the responsibility to have these quarterly updates between the Forest Service and the band. And these are really important updates. But know that we also do a monthly formal consultation under the MOU, which there's this constant communication. And again, the bands are really participating in key meetings. They're coming to the table early in our IDT meetings for NEPA, our interdisciplinary teams. And as I said earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit about cooperating agency and that participation that's codified in law. Next slide, please. So when we talk about cooperating agency, this is a big part of what this MOU really is addressing as well. Not just the shared decision-making, but how does it look when the Forest Service and the band are communicating and working through something that needs to happen. And again, it's tied to the forest plan. So it's kind of this whole moving process. And so know that under 40 CFR 1501 7 sub E, a cooperating agency only qualifies a state, a tribe, or a local agency of similar qualifications to become a cooperating agency with the agreement of the agency lead. And so it's not just anyone can become a cooperating agency, but when we talk about under 40 CFR 15018 and cooperating agencies, this emphasizes agency cooperation early in the NEPA process, which is what this MOU has set forth. And then again, having a state, a tribe, a local agency of similar qualifications becoming a cooperating agency by agreement with the Forest Service. And so that was something that the MOU codified. Our implementation of the MOU is addressing, our conversations are addressing, and it's allowing us to honor that unique legal relationship. And so at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a list of where it says, basically Leech Lake shall. And that language is directly from 40 CFR 1508.8 subsections B, 1, 3, and 5. That isn't something that we just pulled out, but that is codified in the CFR. Next slide, please. So we've got a lot to talk about today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this portion by sharing with you that, when I was in the regional office and I was part of this process from a different lens, there's a lot of sides of this and a lot of thought, consideration, collaboration that really went into the development of this MOU. It wasn't done in a vacuum. And, for those of you that know or don't know, the Forest Service is definitely a recognized leader among federal land management agencies in partnering really appropriately and collaboratively with American Indian and Alaska Native tribal governments. And it's not the individuals, it's about the collaboration with the governments for the better of the community. It's like what we say, for the greatest good, for the greatest number. And so everything really, we all have a conservation ethic, everyone on this call. And so that's really where this has come. Also, some of this has come from the heart, is the conservation ethic. And so the Eastern region also demonstrates the highest standards for support of tribal sovereignty, the recognition of Indigenous values as shared values in our work, protection of reserved rights and cultural properties, consultation and collaboration, and really being not just government to government relationships, but partners and deep partners in landscape scale conservation across many of our users and collaboratively with everyone involved. And so I'm going to wrap it up here. The federal government, just so you know, has trust responsibility of 574 recognized Native American tribes. The Forest Service chief in 2016 made this commitment through his letter to the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe to honor their treaties, the Forest Service mission, and fulfilling Forest Service trust responsibility. So additionally, we at the Forest Service and everyone across the federal government is working with new executive orders from the current administration to recognize trust responsibilities and to strengthen these relationships between federal agencies and tribal nations. The current administration is committed to upholding the United States trust responsibility to these nations, strengthening the relationship between the United States government and Indian tribes, and working to empower tribal nations to govern their own communities and make their own decisions by strengthening the nation-to-nation relationship. They also have asked federal agencies to help restore tribal lands, address climate change, and safeguard natural and cultural resources while expanding economic opportunity and community development in Native communities, as well as all of our local communities. So we have a really big lift on our plate to really help, especially in these challenging economic times. But I wanted to share with you just a few of these federal priorities as we move forward working with tribal nations. So I want to say thank you for listening, and I've provided the why and what of the MOU process. Now I'm going to turn it back to Keith to talk about the how of the MOU implementation and our ongoing work with DVCs, Tribal Forest Protection Act projects, 638 contracting with the Forest Service, and all kinds of other exciting things. So take it away, Keith. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jen. Jen covered all the political stuff. I'm glad she did that. She's way better at it than I am. Next slide, please. So what is a healthy forest? That's the question. That's the first thing that was coming up. And if you look at the map that's on here, even though it's kind of squished, we were always saying that timber harvest is excessive on the Leech Lake Reservation. And if you look here, there's a mill in Bemidji that does pine studs. There's a mill in Grand Rapids that does pulp. So there's a lot of pine and a lot of aspen going out. And if you tried to put the Leech Lake Reservation any better into that 50-mile overlap, I don't think you could. I mean, so there is something to be said there that, the timber coming off the Leech Lake Reservation was definitely excessive, trying to meet the needs of the local mills. And that's not the belief that the Leech Lake people were trying to bring forward. When I graduated college a lifetime ago, I was taught that a healthy forest, it's insect and disease free. You got all these healthy trees, and a monoculture is a good idea. That's what they taught me. Growing space, you want to keep it below the A line. You want to keep it above the B line. They teach you these things. Ecologically, I've learned now over the years, I've had good teachers. I've seen Brian's on here. Brian is very steeped in it. You'll hear from him later. That a true forest, a healthy forest is far beyond that. Next slide, please. So one of the mandates that came down from the chief of the Forest Service was to have the tribe draft these desired vegetative conditions. And when we did that, we didn't want to pin ourselves into a corner. So we wanted to have these goals be broad, be landscape, go across property lines to cover all the areas where tribal members retain treaty rights. We wanted to try to find as best we could a crossover between traditional ecological knowledge and the best available science, the Western science, which is the language that the Forest Service is going to understand. And we bring that in there. And again, reflect tribal priorities. Next slide, please. So we came up with 8 DVCs. You can see them on here, but I like the next slide better. So let's go to the next one. If we take them and we can break them up into 3 different categories. We got a cultural category where we're going to protect the cultural integrity of Leech Lake. Culture is ongoing. I mean, there's a lot of people that figure culture, give it a time. Was it 50 years ago? Was it 100 years ago? Culture is still happening today. Cultural identity still exists today, and impacts to traditional cultural properties and threatened and endangered species are impacts to this cultural identity because of a holistic viewpoint. The ecological category, which is the one that I spend most of my time dealing with, we wanted the Forest Service, they got their blocks of functioning old growth stands. It doesn't mean that the trees are gigantic, but it does mean that there are old growth characteristics there. I mean, you could have a 3,000-year-old forest that all the stems on it are no bigger than your little finger, but it can have those characteristics of old growth. Maintaining and protecting diverse hardwood stands. There's a lot of simplicity on the Chippewa National Forest with between pine plantations and aspen monocultures, which begged for the Aspen Initiative. And, a lot of these are being done in areas where there would have been diverse hardwood stands, so we're looking at native plant community classifications to see what should be there and kind of what abundance should be there of different species, and trying to find this diversity, not just in species, but also in age. And then restoring conifers to ecologically functioning systems. We have a ton of pine plantation up here. You hear it referred to as a biological desert, and it's maximizing the growing space in timber and not allowing any of the growing opportunity to occur below that. And you end up with hazel and very little else. And it's not ecologically functioning. I would wager I'm right with that, Brian. And then the last category is environmental justice. There have been requests made by Leech Lake as the Chippewa National Forest is coming in for projects, and Leech Lake would say, we want this. And the Chippewa National Forest would say, great, we can do that. And then down the road, well, that never happened. And we would ask why, and we would say, well, something came up. We weren't able to do it, so we just did something else. So I mean, it's a life rule that we're taught from a young age. I mean, if you say you're going to do it, do it. It's simple, and they're meant to be simple. Protection of scenic corridors. I mean, we have the Western version. you know, what is a scenic corridor? I mean, well, you got all the major highways, of course. You got scenic highway. Well, that's, you know, it's a scenic corridor because it's actually in the name of the highway. But scenic corridors go far beyond that on the reservation. There are travel routes that were historically used that need to also be protected, you know, and that gets to be the goal. Kind of everything could almost be a scenic corridor. Next slide, please. So those were the DVCs. And the other thing I'm going to weigh heavy on here is the Tribal Forest Protection Act. It was put in by Congress in 2004 as there were large fires in California that were starting on either Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management lands. And you can imagine, I mean, as they're going uphill and they get raging, it doesn't matter how good a work you do on reservation lands. If that fire gets raging enough, it's going to cross the line and it's going to burn up tribal timber, tribal forests. And that's what was happening in California. So this Tribal Forest Protection Act came out largely for fuels. And it allows the reservations to look across the line and say, look, Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service, we don't think you're doing a good enough job here. So we're saying we think you should do this, and this is how, and it comes through the form of a letter, and it's signed by the reservation and sent. We send ours to the supervisor's office, and from there it goes to the regional office. The regional office needs to approve these. Somebody, when they created this act, they went beyond just fuels, and they said if the land is in need of restoration, which is the portion of this act that we have grabbed onto full force. Next slide, please. So we have to date 5 Tribal Forest Protection Act projects that have been approved by the region. We have 2 of them that were red pine, white spruce thinning ones. We started out small. The idea that anything new, I mean, people are going to be cautious. It's kind of scary. So we started out small, you know, and let everybody kind of dip their toes in, see how they felt about it. And once there was a comfort level, then we blew it up into this full scale, saying that any of your pine, and we use the years between 20 and 40 years old, when you still have live crown on there and you're still getting growth from it, these stands were getting far, far too dense, and they were starting to lose their live crown. And we're saying, you have to get in there earlier. You have to thin them early, thin them often, and retain that live crown, and ultimately end up with these missing across the landscape. We had a project, when I was speaking to our other wildlife biologists, I see Tanya's on here, Steve Mortenson's our other one. I was telling him that TFBA can work for other departments. And he asked me, well, how would it work for wildlife? I told him, pick a topic. And he brought up snowshoe hare habitat expansion. And Tanya's going to go far more in depth on this than I am. So I'm just going to skip over that one then. Aspen is the 800-pound gorilla here on the Leech Lake Reservation. It's the easiest to manage. I mean, a 5-year-old can manage an aspen stand. You know, all you got to do is cut it and wait, and then cut it again. And it's a highly marketable species. So it's really popular. There's a lot of aspen. There's every agency up here says there's too much aspen. They have too many acres of aspen, but nobody will do anything about it. Years ago, I was at a regional landscape committee meeting, and there was an older forester there, and he said he would go into these stands with nice aspen, 10, 12-inch aspen, perfect to go to the mill. And he would look at it and say, well, it should be something else. How can I get it to become something else, the something else that it wants to be? He said he'd rub his chin whiskers and think about it. And then ultimately he just, you know what? I'm just going to cut it, and I'm going to let the next guy worry about it. And people laughed. But there's a lot of truth said in jest. You know, there's a lot of people that do that because it is difficult. Aspen is very vigorous. it'll take over an area in a New York minute. And the last one that we got approved was our fire ecology, fire restoration TFPA, which a lot of these red pine white spruce thinning projects, these plantations are growing on lands that are keyed through the native plant community classification as fire dependent lands. Dependent, you know, they don't just want it, desire it, they're dependent. And in areas where fire hasn't happened in over 100 years, that forest is not allowed to do what it wants to do. We have out year ones that we're looking at doing, and we just haven't done them yet. You know, and we'll probably get to them. Next slide, please. So the snowshoe hare one that I referred to is basically, it's just trying to link snowshoe hare from one white cedar stand to another and creating habitat in between. I'm just going to pass on that for now. I'm going to I don't want to steal Tanya's thunder, so I'm going to skip over that one now. Next slide, please. Our TFPA pine spruce restoration. You know, this started in 2016. And if you look at the map here, when we expanded it to cover nearly the 16,000 acres of red pine and white spruce plantation located inside the Chippewa National Forest, there's a lot of it. And you can see in between Lake Winnebagosh and Cass Lake, there's a concentration of red, a concentration of these red pine stands. That was an area that we pulled out for its own unique project that we've called the Sand Plains Pine Project, which we're going to get into later. And some of the actions we're doing, I mean, again, we're telling the Chippewa National Forest, you need to thin these earlier. And that's inherent in just about every agency up here. I mean, they wait too long. When the live crown gets down to 10 or 20%, I mean, those trees are done. They're not going to do anything anymore. Keep that live crown at 50, 60%, and just let it go forward. You know, and realizing that the growing space in there shouldn't just be maximized for tree growth. You know, historically, there were fruiting shrubs that grew out there. There were blueberries that all fruited out there. There was wildlife that relied on various different kinds of forests. All of that needs to be taken into account. It isn't just the maximization of growing space for trees. Next slide, please. This is the Sand Plain Pine Project that I referred to. That's that heavy concentration of red stands that were in between Lake Winnebagosh and Cass Lake. We'll get into that in a later discussion today. But it's been a wonderful pilot project for working together with the CHIP. It's been one where I know Jenn has worked on it. Todd Tisler, I assume he's on here. He's been integral in working on this. You know, there's been a lot of people cutting their teeth on this project. Next slide, please. The last TFPA that we had was fire restoration. If you look at the map here, I don't have the exact acres, but you can see the stands that are categorized as fire dependent. It's a lot. It's something that's missing, you know, and ever since the 70s, or even before the 70s, I mean, when Smokey the Bear was coming out and he was, you know, only you can prevent forest fires. Everybody said he can't have fires in the woods. You know, and it's, in my mind, it's grown to be probably the #1 thing that is missing from the forests on the Leech Lake Reservation is fire. You know, it was a management tool that's been used since time immemorial, and it needs to be brought back again. And it's been in excess of 100 years in many of these areas since there's been a fire, because of the push to put fires out as soon as they happen, instead of letting them do what they're going to do. And how much of a crown can you afford to lose? You know, the Forest Service has kind of glommed onto a number. Just about every agency has glommed onto a number of 10%. And I would say if it exceeds that, so what? It's what nature would have done. our wildlife guy would say some of these areas that get burnt over and turned into these jackstraw piles of burnt timber, that's a wildlife mecca. It's a regeneration forest mecca. You know, so viewing things through a different lens is something that needs to happen. You know, changing the paradigm on why wood is cut needs to happen. You know, instead of we need to provide wood to the local mills as the number one, the driving idea, change the paradigm. The wood going to the mill becomes a means to the end, where ecological restoration becomes that end in and of itself. Next slide, please. So then we took, in 2018, the US Farm Bill came out with the ability for tribes to enter into 638 contract authority with the USDA. To do that, you had to have a TFPA project, which again, we had numerous ones. And this was pushed very hard by the Intertribal Timber Council. And they actually called me after that Farm Bill came out and said, there's 10 pilot projects in here. We want you to do one of them because you have so many of these, you're doing good things. So we've recently entered into one now. Next slide, please. We've recently entered into one using our original TFPA project, our small, dip your toes in the water, 48-acre overdense pine thinning that we did. Had a very high basal area, the live crown was declining, hazel was everywhere. We thinned that in 2016 under our TFPA. We removed the brush in 2017 under TFPA. We've pursued a grant, a Reserve Treaty Rights Lands grant, and we brushed it again in 2020. So now we've taken it and we've entered this into a 638 contract, and we're calling it phase 2. And what phase 2 is now we're going to come in and we're going to thin it again. And we're going to focus on the non-pine species. We're going to try and free those up a little bit to become a component of the canopy of this forest. That's phase 2. We're going to run a fire following this thinning. We're going to run a fire across there to begin to restore fire to the area. And then we're going to seed it with some native seed over half of the project and leave the other half to naturally come up and see, has this seed source, does it still exist? Or is it gone? It's an interesting thing that I would like to see. I mean, if you don't have a fire for 100 years, does that seed source, is it still persisting in the ground? I don't know. There's a lot of questions. As we call it a phase 2, there's a phase 3, but that's another story. Next slide, please. So as we move forward in this new era, I guess, of collaboration and co-management, things that we found is, I mean, you need support from both sides. You know, this isn't a one-sided venture. I mean, people need to earnestly buy into this, and you need to push. And again, what you say you're going to do it. You know, honesty, integrity. I mean, these things they're simple. They're simple life traits that people have, and it just needs to be pushed forward. You know, on our TFPA, we started small. The pine spruce thinning TFPA, the snowshoe hare one. Once that one's done and it shows success, and I think it will, Tanya, then we can expand that, and we can do a reservation wide or even a forest wide, you know, and start including all these things. You know, we have pine spruce thinnings on top of fire dependent areas that have snowshoe hare habitat going into them. Multiple projects on the same exact tract of land. That's the tribal ideology. That's the holistic way of thinking. It's keeping everything in consideration and not just looking at the canopy and saying, sweet, I'm between the A and the B line. How good am I? Next slide, please. And you know, we've had these outcomes. I mean, we get along. The meetings when we have between the CHIP and the tribe, when I first started here, there was a lot of tension when those meetings would happen. You know, now people come into the room. I mean, I was joking with Jenn yesterday about being a Packer fan. You know, it's this simple humanity, and just, you know, we need to get along before we can work together. And getting along, that's a key thing. You know, I mean, understanding what makes people tick. The management practices, you know, again, that begs into the whole changing the paradigm. You know, we're pushing for ecological health. Instead of economic rotation, we're pushing for ecologic rotation. Species, you know, the snowshoe hare is a keystone one. If you build it, they will come. If you build the snowshoe hare habitat, the other species are going to prosper as well. And that potential to scale up projects and start overlapping one on top of the other. Next slide, please. These are the next steps. You know, I mean, and they're ongoing. I had most of my day yesterday was dealing with the chip. Most of my day today will be dealing with the chip. I deal with the chip daily, multiple hours a day. We're moving into dealing with the state and local governments. I sit on the Minnesota Forest Resource Council, where I deal more with elected officials down there. Some of the Forest Service staff deal with those folks more than I do. We both deal with forest products industry. Some of this work that we're doing as co-management is very scary to the forest products industry. They don't know how it's going to shake out. That's another story as well. Non-governmental organizations. I mean, we've also brought into the fold the Nature Conservancy, done a lot of work with the Nature Conservancy in recent years. And then partners and stakeholders. Stakeholders is always an interesting word to me. I see tribes often called a stakeholder or a special interest group, which is my personal favorite. I mean, people have a hard time embracing the idea that tribes truly are sovereign nations, and they need to be treated as such. It needs to be government to government, and that's changing. It's not just changing here; it's changing nationwide. You know, and then community presentations. I mean, we've had talks with the Chippewa National Forest about meeting with the local Indian councils. We've got 13 communities on the Leech Lake Reservation. And projects that are occurring in their area, that local Indian council needs to be made aware of it. And it needs to be explained in layman's terms. None of this A-level, B-level, basal area, codes for trees, none of that. You know, just talking person to person. You know, so we all live here together. Next slide, please. Now, as I wrap it up, Ben Benoit, he's our environmental director. This was an idea that he brought up numerous times, you know, that this isn't just a forest. There's a lot. For a long time, the Chippewa National Forest has looked at, well, this is my job. This is where I go and I'm Johnny Punch Clock and that's what I do. But it isn't just a forest, it's a homeland. You know, he said he would wake up and he was already at work because he lives inside the reservation. You know, his niece one time, they were going out in the woods for something. That's where I got that he said, so you ready to go out in the woods? And she said, I'm not going into the woods. I am the woods. And I hold that story dear. I mean, I think it's cute, you know, that this little girl is being brought up that she's not living in the woods, that she is actually an integral part of the woods. And those are different viewpoints that need to be embraced up here. I believe that's our last slide. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenn, and thank you, Keith. That was a great way to start this presentation today. We have a few minutes. We'll hit you with a couple of questions if that's okay. And I do encourage the audience to continue to post questions in chat. If you think of questions for both Jenn and Keith, they will be with us through the day and at the end of the symposium. Keith, it's for either one of you, but we've promoted, I guess this might be better for Jenn, you know, NAA has promoted this MOU as unique, but the question is, are there other MOUs between the Forest Service and tribes elsewhere in the US that you're aware of, Jenn?
Yeah, there's many that are like, we have a 20+ year MOU with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. This MOU is unique in the fact that it is very specific to a shared decision-making model. And that was kind of some of the challenges and hiccups we ran into in creating this model, why we had to work with OGC so closely and our great legal scholars and minds in the agency to make sure that we were not overstepping our laws, rules, and authorities while we were trying to honor the federal trust responsibility to the band. And so this is a unique MOU in the fact that it was really one of the first clearly defined co-stewardship types of MOUs with the shared decision-making model. But there are numerous MOUs for relationships, work, honoring, certain responsibilities between the Forest Service to the tribes and the bands nationwide. But again, this also flows from the unique land base that we share, where we've got the overlay of, the forest and the reservation together. So,
excellent, thank you. Okay, we've got a question in from Liz Winlock. This is great information. How could smaller groups like urban park systems go about getting a collaborative consult relationship going with Native groups? Any suggestions, ideas?
Yeah, Liz, that's a great question. I appreciate that question because, we have like an Urban Connections program in the Forest Service. And like we've got a Urban Connections representative, Terry Heyer, in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so, she works with everyone who would be connected, in underserved communities in the greater Twin Cities area. But she also works with, Indigenous individuals who live in the Twin Cities. So you can do that a lot of in the Eastern region. I'm not sure where you're located, but in the Eastern region, we have representatives in St. Louis, in Chicago, in Boston. So if you're working with a smaller group or there is a tribal office, like in Milwaukee, there's SEOTS, which is the Southeastern Oneida Tribal Services, or you have Forest County Potawatomi. Some tribes will have offices to support their community members. And so you basically can work with Urban Connections, work with those communities to really engage with some of those Indigenous folks that aren't, as tied to their community as they would like to be for work purposes or family purposes or different things like that. So I hope that helps. And you're in Louisville. Yeah, I'm not sure if Region 8, but I'm sure, I think I saw Lexi Rue Harris on here. So, she is your tribal liaison in Region 8 for the region. So I would say reach out to Lexi Rue Harris and she can probably answer some questions or help you get connected, because I think I saw her on. And if you're on, hi, Lexi.
Fantastic.
Well, a couple of things I'd add to that, Liz, would be, come from a good place. If you're going to ask, I've run into areas where I've had people come and want us to sign on, like for grants, things like that, where it looks kitschy to have a tribe signed on, and it isn't. And they don't really care what we think about it. They just want to be able to put our name on there. So, come from a good place. And the way, is to listen. That's the number one thing that I could tell anybody is, if you're going to deal with a tribe, the first thing you need to do is listen. I always tell everybody that's why 2 ears, 1 mouth, right? You should listen twice as much as you talk. So, people will tell you, maybe not exactly, but they're going to tell you what they want, if you're truly listening to them. So.
Thank you for that, Keith. Great advice. I'm going to ask another question here, and I'm again encouraging the audience, but is, Keith, you sort of started, at the end, as you were wrapping up, you were talking about outcomes. Is the general sense, and maybe it's too soon to tell, but the general sense from both the band and the forest that this MOU and this new approach to collaboration and co-management, is it resulting in positive outcomes from the standpoint of if any of this work had been baselined, are you starting to see positive outcomes for conservation that are measurable, or is it a little bit too soon yet?
It's a little bit soon, but
okay.
The initial project, the one that we've entered into a 638 with, I took a couple, are also on the Minnesota Forest Resource Council. I took them up there to take a look around, and we're seeing fruiting shrubs, Juneberry, raspberry, and then blueberries that are bearing fruit on that project now. They weren't there a few years ago. So, I mean, if you're looking, you're starting to see some benefit. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, great. We have just a couple more minutes left before break, and another question comes in from Jenny Selgrath. Could you talk more about the process of integrating traditional ecological knowledge, into management? It came up several times in the presentations. Is there anything you might be able to offer additional?
I think the best story I got for it is with the onset of climate change. When you're getting that you need to be resistant, resilient to climate change. Right now, we were having a meeting with the Minnesota DNR, and this was 7-8 years back, maybe something like that. And we were sitting down, and the DNR is like, well, maybe we need to diversify our forests a little bit to make them a little more resistant, resilient. And I started laughing. I said, tribes have been saying this for a long time. Everything has a part. Sometimes, your scrub oak, it still plays a part in the forest. This crooked birch tree that's growing on the side, it plays a part in the forest. That's what tribes have been saying for forever. And now the DNR is starting to realize, well, maybe there's some credence to that. But some people are slow learners.
Very, very good. So at this point, we're going to hold